It was another ordinary day at Glenwood High, but for Amina, it was anything but ordinary. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the day, she walked down the crowded hallway, her head down and shoulders slightly hunched. She always tried to avoid the attention of others, especially the ones who made her feel small. Today, however, the usual calm she carried seemed fragile, like a thread that could snap at any moment. The school, with its faded lockers and bright fluorescent lights, felt overwhelming. But it wasn't the school that made Amina feel out of place. It was the people. Jake, the notorious bully of Glenwood High, had made it his personal mission to make Amina's life difficult. It wasn't always physical. Most of the time, it was the cruel words, the mocking stares, the way he'd laugh as he walked past her in the hallways. But today felt different. Amina couldn't quite place it, but the tension in the air was thicker than usual. She felt it in her gut as she passed by Jake's usual spot near the water fountain. He was leaning against the wall, surrounded by his usual group of followers, all laughing and joking, as if nothing could go wrong in their world. As Amina walked by, she heard Jake's voice cut through the chatter. "Hey, look, it's the quiet little princess," he sneered, loud enough for everyone in earshot to hear. Amina paused, her heart skipping a beat. She had learned to ignore him over the past few months, to pretend he didn't bother her. But today, something felt different. She didn't turn around. She couldn't afford to. If she turned around, if she engaged, it would only give him more power, more reason to push her further. She kept walking, her eyes focused ahead, hoping that if she ignored him long enough, he would lose interest and move on to his next target. But Jake wasn't done. He pushed off the wall and took a few steps towards her, the sound of his shoes against the floor loud and deliberate. "Did you hear me, freak?" Jake said, his voice sharper now, more hostile. "What's the matter?" Too scared to talk. He stepped in front of her, blocking her path. His friend snickered, egging him on. Amina felt the heat rise to her face. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, to tell him to back off, but the words stuck in her throat. She hated this feeling, this powerlessness. She had been dealing with this for so long, and yet, every encounter felt like the first. The embarrassment, the humiliation, it never got easier. "You really think you're all that, don't you?" Jake continued, a twisted grin spreading across his face. "Think you're better than everyone else because you're so different?" He sneered again, looking her up and down as if she were something to be picked apart. "I bet you don't even have any friends. Look at you. You're nothing." Amina's hands balled into fists at her sides, but she didn't move. She knew if she reacted now, if she tried to push past him or yell at him, it would only escalate things. But her mind raced. Why was he so fixated on her? What had she ever done to him? She had always kept to herself, always tried to stay out of the way. What did she have that made her a target? Jake's voice grew louder. "Get lost, ape. You don't belong here." He threw the words at her like they were daggers. Amina flinched, but she didn't move. She wasn't going to let him see her flinch. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of breaking her. She had been dealing with this for so long. The teasing, the taunts, the isolation. And each time, it had hurt just as much as the first time. But this time, there was something else brewing inside her. Something she couldn't ignore. Amina's jaw tightened as she slowly raised her head. She locked eyes with Jake, and for the first time, she didn't look away. Her heart pounded in her chest, but there was something else, too, a feeling she hadn't recognized before. It was a spark that could turn into a fire. She wasn't going to let this continue. Not this time. Jake's mocking grin faltered for just a second as Amina stood her ground, her eyes unwavering. But then, he shook his head, dismissing the change he had just witnessed. He wasn't ready to back off yet. No, Jake was far from done. But something had shifted. Amina had stood up to him in the only way she could at that moment, by not backing down. She had taken the first step, the step that would set everything into motion. Just get lost, okay? Jake muttered, waving his hand dismissively, as if the encounter meant nothing to him. But deep down, Amina knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths, and maybe, just maybe, the next time, things would be different. As she walked away, her mind was a storm of emotions. She had felt something stir inside her. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was strong. She wasn't going to let him win. Not this time. The stage was set. What Jake didn't know was that Amina wasn't just some helpless girl anymore. She was someone with a hidden strength, someone who would soon prove to him and everyone else that bullying came with consequences, and she would make sure Jake learned that lesson. The rest of the day dragged on for Amina, but her mind was consumed with the encounter she had just had with Jake. She replayed the moment over and over in her head, trying to understand why she had felt so different, why her reaction had been unlike anything before. She had always been the quiet, invisible girl at school, the one who avoided conflict at all costs. But today, something had snapped. Something inside her had shifted. And it wasn't just the anger. It was something deeper, something stronger. She wasn't afraid anymore. After the bell rang for lunch, Amina walked to the cafeteria, her thoughts still clouded by what had happened. She stood in line to grab her lunch, doing her best to keep her head down and avoid drawing attention. But it wasn't easy. The whispers had started again. She could hear the murmurs behind her, the glances that were thrown in her direction. Everyone had heard what happened in the hallway, and now she was the talk of the school. It didn't help that Jake and his group were sitting in their usual spot, laughing, as if nothing had happened. His voice was loud, and Amina could feel his eyes on her, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of looking back. She found a quiet corner to sit in, hoping the attention would eventually fade away. But as soon as she sat down, the door to the cafeteria opened, and in walked Jake. He was surrounded by his friends, and they were all talking, laughing, and joking like they always did. Jake's eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. He wasn't looking at her with the same smug confidence as usual. This time, there was something different in his gaze. It wasn't mockery. It was something else, something that made Amina's heart skip a beat. She quickly looked away, focusing on the sandwich in front of her, trying to ignore the feeling of his gaze burning into her back. She didn't want to acknowledge him, didn't want to give him another reason to make fun of her. But then, just as she was about to take a bite of her lunch, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching. The noise of the cafeteria seemed to fade away, and Amina's heart began to race. She knew it was him. She could feel it. Jake's voice broke through the silence. "Hey, Amina," he said, his tone softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Can we talk for a second?" Amina froze. Her hand, which had been holding the sandwich, suddenly felt heavy. She didn't want to talk to him. Not after everything that had happened. But she couldn't just ignore him, could she? There was a strange feeling rising in her chest, a mix of confusion and curiosity. Why was he approaching her? What did he want? She took a deep breath, slowly turning to face him. Jake stood there, his friends lingering behind him. But they were no longer laughing. They were watching, waiting for something to happen. Amina's eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw a hint of uncertainty in his expression. Jake wasn't the same confident bully he had been earlier. There was a crack in his tough exterior, and it caught Amina off guard. "Why?" Amina finally asked, her voice calm but firm. She had spent so long avoiding him, avoiding the truth of the situation. But now it was different. She wasn't going to back down. Jake seemed to hesitate for a moment, his eyes flicking over to his friends. Then he looked back at Amina, and for the first time, she saw a glimpse of genuine regret in his eyes. I didn't mean to go that far," Jake said, his voice softer than she expected. "I was just messing around, but I guess I went too far." Amina blinked in disbelief. Was he really apologizing? Was this some kind of joke, or was he serious? "I didn't know," Jake continued, his voice quiet now. almost apologetic. "I didn't know who your dad was. If I'd known, I wouldn't have." Amina cut him off before he could finish. "You think that's what matters? That you didn't know who my dad was?" She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. "You don't get to treat me like that just because you didn't know who I am. No one gets to treat anyone like that." Jake's eyes widened, as if he hadn't expected this kind of response from her. The rest of the cafeteria had gone silent now. Everyone was watching, waiting for what would happen next. Amina could feel the weight of all those eyes on her, but she wasn't going to let it shake her. This was her moment. "You hurt me, Jake," she said, her voice stronger now. "And I don't need you to apologize because of who my dad is. I need you to understand that what you did was wrong, no matter who I am or who my family is. You don't get to pick on people because you think you're better than them. You don't get to bully people just because it's easy." For a moment, there was only silence between them. Jake stood there, looking at her as if the weight of her words had hit him harder than anything else. His friends didn't know what to say. They had never seen him like this before. Finally, Jake nodded slowly. "I get it," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry, Amina. I messed up." And just like that, the tension seemed to lift. Amina didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, she felt like she had control of the situation. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had stood up for herself, and Jake had heard her. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. The next few days at Glenwood High were tense. Jake's apology had shocked Amina, but she couldn't help but wonder whether it had been sincere. She wasn't sure what to make of it yet, but she knew one thing for sure. The fallout from that lunch encounter would not be easily ignored. As the days went on, the ripple effect of what had happened in the cafeteria began to spread. At first, Jake acted like nothing had changed. He was back to his usual self, loud, arrogant, and surrounded by his group of friends. But there was a noticeable shift. He didn't go out of his way to taunt Amina like he had before, but his usual confident swagger had been replaced by a sort of nervous energy whenever he crossed paths with her. He didn't make eye contact anymore, and sometimes Amina could almost see the guilt in his eyes, though he would quickly look away, pretending it wasn't there. The rumors had started almost immediately. Whispers filled the hallways, and by the end of the week, nearly everyone knew about the confrontation. Amina had become the unexpected center of attention. But it wasn't the kind of attention she wanted. People weren't exactly praising her for standing up to Jake. They were simply talking about the incident like it was the latest gossip. The students who once ignored her now had something to say, and Amina couldn't help but feel exposed. Every time someone looked at her, she couldn't tell if they were impressed or just waiting for something more to happen. Despite the attention, Amina tried to keep her head down, focusing on her classes and avoiding the whispers. She was used to being invisible, and now she just wanted things to return to normal. But that was impossible. What Jake hadn't realized when he made that apology was that his actions had consequences, and they were beginning to unfold in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started with the students. His friends, who had always followed his lead, began to question their loyalty. They weren't sure how to behave now that their leader had admitted to being wrong. Some of them started to distance themselves from Jake, while others began to openly express their discomfort with his behavior. It wasn't that they were suddenly becoming nice or understanding. It was just that they didn't want to be caught up in the fallout. They didn't want to be associated with the bully who had gone too far. Slowly but surely, Jake's circle of friends began to shrink. The real consequences, though, started to hit when the school administration got involved. Amina hadn't expected anything to come from the incident. After all, she hadn't asked for an apology or made a formal complaint. But the whispers and rumors about the confrontation eventually reached the ears of the principal. One morning, Amina was called to the office. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she couldn't help the feeling that something bigger was coming. When she entered the principal's office, she was surprised to find Jake sitting there as well. He looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting nervously between Amina and the principal. Mrs. Carter, the principal, was sitting behind her desk, her expression serious. I just wanted to apologize for what happened," Jake said, his voice quieter than usual. "I didn't mean for things to get out of hand." Mrs. Carter turned her gaze toward Jake. "I'm glad to hear that you recognize the seriousness of your actions. However, there are consequences for bullying, and your behavior has not gone unnoticed." Amina's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. The principal was going to do something about it. This wasn't just a one-time thing that would fade away. Jake was going to face the consequences of his actions. Jake's face turned red as the principal explained the disciplinary actions that would be taken. He was given a warning, along with a series of mandatory counseling sessions and a written apology to Amina. The school had a strict no-tolerance policy when it came to bullying, and although Jake's past actions had been overlooked in the past, this time things were different. This time, there were no excuses. The weight of the consequences seemed to hit Jake in that moment. His shoulders slumped, and he let out a deep sigh, as if the reality of what was happening had finally set in. Amina, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. She hadn't expected the school to take action, and now that they were, she didn't know what to think. The confrontation in the cafeteria had been a turning point, but this was the moment when everything started to change. The power dynamic had shifted. As Amina walked back to class after the meeting, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had stood up for herself, and now the consequences were beginning to unfold. Jake had learned the hard way that his actions had consequences, and he was no longer the untouchable bully he had once been. The school was no longer going to let him get away with it. For the first time in a long while, Amina felt like things were finally starting to go her way. The days following the meeting with the principal were the hardest for Jake. He had always been used to being the center of attention, to having everyone bow to his will. But now, everything felt different. His group of friends had shrunk, and the students who once cheered him on during his bullying now looked at him with judgment. He was no longer the confident, untouchable bully he had been. Instead, he was just another student trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become much more complicated. Jake had never thought he'd find himself in this situation. He had always believed that as long as he kept pushing people around, things would stay the same. But Amina's quiet strength, her ability to stand up to him, had made him realize just how wrong he had been. It wasn't just about her family status or the apology he had given. It was the way she had handled everything, with grace and dignity, while he had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The change wasn't easy for Jake. For the first time in a long while, he found himself alone, walking through the hallways of Glenwood High without the usual group of friends laughing beside him. The whispers still followed him, but they were different now. Instead of being about Amina, they were about him. He could feel the eyes of the other students, and it stung. They weren't impressed by him anymore. They didn't fear him. They pitied him. Jake knew he needed to make things right. But how? He had never known how to fix something he had broken, especially not when it came to a person like Amina. She had been the target of his cruelty for far too long, and now he was realizing just how much damage he had caused. The question gnawed at him constantly. Could he make up for the hurt he had caused? As the days passed, Jake's regret grew. He found himself looking for Amina in the hallways, hoping for a chance to talk to her. But every time he saw her, he hesitated. What could he say? How could he ever make her believe that he was sorry? He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and he wasn't sure how to show her that he had changed. Then, one afternoon, when the final bell rang, Jake found the courage to approach her. Amina was at her locker, her back to him, unaware that he was standing a few steps away. He stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts, and then, taking a deep breath, he walked over to her. Amina turned when she heard footsteps, and her eyes widened slightly when she saw Jake standing in front of her. She didn't move, didn't speak, as if waiting to see what he would do. I just wanted to say something," Jake began, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and about everything I did to you. And I know I can't take it back, but I need you to know that I'm really sorry." Amina didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, studying him with an expression that was neither angry nor forgiving. Jake continued, the words tumbling out as if they had been bottled up inside him for so long. "I know I hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want you to know that I get it now. I was wrong. I've been a jerk, and I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want to change. I don't want to be that person anymore." For a long moment, there was silence. Amina looked at him, and Jake could feel the weight of her gaze. It was not the look of someone who had forgotten, nor the look of someone who was easily swayed by words. It was the look of someone who had been hurt, who had seen through the masks that people wore. But it was also a look of someone who, despite the hurt, was capable of seeing growth,